The great mystery of human capital in aviation. Oftentimes we tend to think about aviation professionals and they become a mystery. Much in the same way that we think about our doctors and our surgeons two-dimensionally, we think about our aviation professionals in the same way. Rarely do we think about what does it take to be an aviation professional. Our searches, our coaching of aviation teams have given us a little bit of insight into successful aviation leadership. One of the most critical elements of a good aviation leader and aviation teams is when we look at them, they look like downtown. They have the same culture, communication style, and behaviors that we see at the corporate headquarters. Culture alignment is critical. One of the flags we oftentimes watch for is, does the hangar feel different than downtown? We'll spend some time later in one of our videos discussing about staffing levels, what's the right level of FTEs, how do you figure out your philosophy towards staffing. It's an important part of the process. I will highlight right now one critical element. Do you staff for the operational demand or do you staff for the leadership demand? Would it be okay to have an aviation team that only functions operationally but does not have the bandwidth to meet, to communicate, to do team building, to develop themselves? If that's part of your corporate culture, then we would encourage you to consider emulating that at the hangar. So oftentimes we focus on technical skills, but we really encouraging evaluating cultural alignment, communication, business acumen, HR knowledge, legal knowledge, all those things which might introduce risk if a leader is unaware of them. It's not just good enough to be able to fly or work on an airplane. There are some assessments that we can use when hiring aviation leaders and aviation personnel. There are technical assessments, simulator evaluations, knowledge tests that are fairly common in the industry. We would encourage you to think about those in creative ways. Don't just measure for okay, measure for excellence. But there are also some assessments we can use to measure the individual. We have a personal bias toward using the Berkman and the Hogan. It's a regular part of our screening process to understand how leaders function, what they need, both when they're in a good place and when they're in a bad place. The Hogan specifically allows us to evaluate how they present to others. We can use that as a coaching tool and a screening tool. What are their values? You know, oftentimes when there's a value disconnect with the organization they serve or the team they're going to function in, that's where we end up coaching. That's where there's conflict. And finally, we can measure with assessments, how do people present when they're no longer in a good place? How do they misbehave? It's an important part of the process. It's something we all do. Helping to understand that can help you navigate the HR challenges. Oftentimes, aviation teams believe or are asked to do all the hiring on their own. Executives, HR professionals are afraid to get in the mix because they don't feel qualified to assess professional aviators and technicians. I would encourage you to develop a partnership. There is value that you as an executive and your HR team brings to the hiring equation that the aviation team does not have. Really healthy processes are collaborative and inclusive. When we do a risk analysis, one of the areas that we focus on is Flsa classification. It's oftentimes something that we identify that is either misunderstood or not properly applied. In fact, there is new steering in 2019 around Flsa classification and business aviation professionals. We'd encourage you to have your HR team, your legal team, and your aviation professional to become aware of that new guidance by the Department of Labor in 2019, and it may illuminate issues that you may want to address. An area that we identify oftentimes in reviews is sick policies. Sick policies in the corporate world may not work with aviation teams. You do not want to have an incentive for aviators and technicians to work when they're not feeling well. It may take creative HR solutions to address this element of risk. Just recently, the Department of Labor issued new guidance around the concept of independent contractors. It is an ongoing conversation of aviation, as they're oftentimes used regularly in a lot of aviation teams to manage elastic capacity. There are pretty significant risks around independent contractors. There's some ways to mitigate them, but is it a conversation that we regularly are engaged with? And finally, retirement. There's a lot of confusion and guidance and conflicting guidance in our industry around the applicability of mandatory retirement. We've done a number of benchmarking studies recently, and it still is an item which is not fully addressed by business aviation teams. It's fully addressed in the air carrier world with the airlines, but not in our world. And it goes well beyond cognitive impairment that comes with age. We encourage you to evaluate whether a retirement policy is appropriate for your organization. Oftentimes we hear, wow, these folks are highly compensated. We're on the backside of a highly significant pilot shortage and technician shortage. We really don't know in this time of ambiguity what the future holds. But what we do know is there's probably going to be changes to compensation. In our industry, there are not a lot of benchmarks. Your peers may not be your peers when it comes to compensation. Geography, type of equipment, the type of operation, company, revenue, those traditional indices that are used in compensation benchmarking may not be valid for business aviation. It's dynamic and it's hard to understand. There are very few surveys available that are highly accurate for our industry. We really encourage a collaborative conversation with your compensation team, your aviation team, and you as the executive to whom aviation may report. Proactive are the companies that tend to be successful when it comes to compensation. Oftentimes we hear a conversation around all the pilots or technicians that are available because the airlines are laying people off. The reality is, in our recent calculations, this will increase the business aviation workforce by less than 10%. Now, we're not quite sure what a 10% increase in supply will do to compensation, but certainly the media and the impression is it more than 10%. It will have an impact, but we're not quite sure how much. Being aware of unique policies, compensation requirements, the DNA of aviation professionals, it probably doesn't fit most of your business practices, but it's critical to understand how it applies.